Good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of Forever Tibet. Today we are going to discuss environmental concerns on Tibetan Plateau. It's a very important topic for all of us, and it affects the whole planet. I invite Silvia Francescon, responsible for the ecology agenda of UBI, to join me on stage. Enjoy the day.
Who are following us via the social media, via Facebook and YouTube channel of the Italian Buddhist Union. I'm very happy to be here, of course, and I want to express my gratitude to the Italian Buddhist Union and to Filippo Scianna in particular, and to the entire board of directors of the Italian Buddhist Union. Today we are talking about a very important issue, as Silvia was mentioning before. I'm very happy that this is happening just after the conversation we had yesterday on the political issues, because this is all interconnected, of course. I will introduce you our distinguished speakers in a few minutes. I would like just to highlight to you few issues that we are going to cover today. We are going to talk about the environmental concerns on the Tibetan Plateau. Let me say something. The Tibetan Plateau and the glaciers is the biggest freshwater reservoir after the Arctic and the Antarctic. This is why it is called the third pole. Is this something that is the melting of the third pole, something that matters only for Tibetans? No, it's not. And it's not because we will hear our speakers talking about this. It's not because that glacier is a source of life. And I like to underline a source of life. We keep on talking about resources. We should stop talking about resources and start thinking about sources of life, because glaciers, rivers, oceans, mountains, trees are not resources. They are sources of life. And the Tibetan glacier is a source of life for almost 1.5 billion people living downstream, almost 2 billions. Let me say it again. 1/5 of the world population live because of the Tibetan Plateau. So is this a matter only for Tibetans? No, it's not. As His Holiness always say, it's a matter for the entire world. But he says we should acknowledge and involve the entire expertise of the stewards of the land, of the Tibetan land, and the Tibetans. And this is a very important point. Because when we talk about colonization, as we were talking yesterday, we are not just talking about occupation. That occupation becomes extractivism when we talk about minerals. That occupation becomes big dams when we talk about waters. And that occupation becomes cultural appropriation when we don't give voice to the Tibetan and to the Tibetan stewardship of their land. So this is why this is so important, and it's not just a matter for Tibet. Let me also acknowledge today all those Tibetan organizations and people who are in Egypt at the COP27 in Egypt, in Sharm el-Sheikh, who are advocating, who are protesting, who are marching for the climate. The issue of climate change in Tibet, as elsewhere in the world, is not just a matter of mitigation. Mitigation meaning cutting the emission of greenhouse gases. Is also a matter of adaptation. Climate change today is a reality, and we have to learn how to deal with it. And again, the Tibetan expertise is extremely important in the definition of the policies of adaptation. Also, adaptation means a compensation for the loss and damages that the population has been subject to. And it's not just a matter of giving money. The rich countries that have benefited from the growth, the economic growth based on fossil fuels, should provide resources and money to those who are mostly affected by climate change without being the responsible for it. It's not just a question of money, it's a question of engaging those population, those people in the process, in the decision making. This is climate justice. It's not just a matter of money, which of course is extremely important. And let me also finish by again expressing gratitude to all of you for being here, for taking care of this, and as a reminder that environment is not just a question of conservation of the land, it's a question of human rights. And we will hear today also about the environmental defenders of Tibet. Environmental defenders have been killed worldwide in a big number. But we hear about this phenomenon mostly in Brazil, for example, in Latin America, elsewhere. We hear much less about Tibet. So this is why today is so important that we talk about this, that we talk about the killing of environmental defenders in Tibet. So thank you very much. And I'll start with calling the first guest. So I ask to Wangpo to come here. And Wangpo, yeah, where you want. Wangpo Tethong is Executive Director of ICT Europe, the head of the ICT office in Amsterdam and Brussels. We were talking last night, you have been also a parliamentarian of the Tibet government in exile, and you dealt a lot with foreign policy. So we are very, very happy to have you here. And actually, we are also very grateful that you brought this video today. I will let you introduce the video that we are going to see. Thank you.
Shall I take this microphone? Good morning. Hello. Yes. Good morning. Good morning. Thank you for this very important introduction to the topic. I think it was quite complete. And it's a huge topic, climate change in Tibet. And I will start with some smaller perspectives on this issue. And also introduce the film that I brought with. As a small boy, you see, my mother would tell me stories about Ladakh. And this area where she grew up, she is a farmer's daughter, is a very dry place. It's high altitude place. You know Ladakh most probably. And the main question that she always had when she wrote letters to Ladakh was there enough snow falling in the winter? And then in spring, her letters would say, now how is the sun? Do we have enough sun to melt the water so that the fields could be watered? So there was this constant sort of thinking about water, about snow, ice, and this was the existential question for the people in Ladakh. And these questions also sort of, impressed me a lot as a child. And I thought of water, Ladakh, as an extremely existential question for the survival of the people there, of my family, yeah. And when my mother used to tell me about Ladakh and how difficult life was in her childhood, and there were famines, there were people who were, you see, really having a hard time to survive on this high altitude. I was very moved and also could share some of her anxiety about these water issues. Now, as a small boy, I also had the chance to visit Ladakh, and I made this journey from Srinagar to Ladakh. And it's a long way, you see. You have to first, there's this green valley of Ladakh, then there's a pass, Sushula Pass, Namkala, and then you sort of enter this moon landscape of Ladakh, and you would see this very special situation there. And the situation of Ladakh, I think, is also comparable to what you see in Tibet, especially in Western Tibet. And you would understand how important water is, how important the management of the water system is. Yeah. And this was in 1970. 1973, there were only like 2 cars in Ladakh, private cars. The rest of the cars were owned by the military. There were some trucks. So it was a different world if compared to today. And the people were poor. Now, this spring, we had a conference in Dharamsala, Dialogue for a Future, and we talked about climate issues, and the question was, can we do something, you see, to sort of show the urgency of the matter? And so we invited, and this was my idea, to invite Sonawonjula from Ladakh and tell us how the situation is. And so he came up with the idea of bringing an ice block from a glacier, from Ladakh, from this very high altitude place, to Dharamsala. And that's the video that you will see. And I think it really sums up a bit the whole issue that is there. And I would like to ask you to give a little bit of attention to what he says, and also what His Holiness says to the issue. And after the film, I would suggest to make some reflections on the topic. And I would like to talk a bit about climate adaptation and so on. Yeah. Okay, please show the film.
July, we, together with some 23 young friends from Sekmol and Hayal, are on a very special expedition to the Khardongla Pass, one of the tallest in the world, to collect a piece of ice that will be taken to Dharamsala in the next 3 days, roughly 72 hours, using bicycles, public transport, and electric vehicles. So after climbing Khardongla Pass with bicycles, our team is now climbing up to the glacier. It's rather treacherous. You may see it easy, but we are walking on waist-deep ice. Where it is hard, we will be able to walk over, but sometimes you can see what happens. So this is what it entails to get to the glacier. The glaciers of Khardongla are melting very fast. I remember personally, when I was younger, some 25 years ago, I would see glaciers coming down to the road. At some point there was a metal bridge with no river underneath, just a glacier. To cover the glacier, there was a metal bridge. Today it's all gravel and stones and no sign of glacier, and because an avalanche took it away. So now these glaciers that used to touch the highway have moved up, or receded rather, higher and higher by a few 100 meters sometimes. So that's the pace at which these glaciers are melting. So here finally we are at the snout of the glacier. My friends are chipping at the ice to get this chunk to be taken to Dharamsala. But working here, even walking here, is rather difficult, as we are at roughly 5,300 plus meters above sea level, and therefore air is rarer, and therefore oxygen also is rarer, roughly at 55 to 7% of that at sea level. So we have to struggle against that at this altitude. Yay! Finally, to make sure that the ice doesn't melt in the next 3 days, 72 hours till it reaches Dharamsala through the hot plains of India with plus 45 degrees, we are using as insulation something very natural, something very local Ladakhi, cashmere fiber, pashmina, the best in fabric around the world, in support of Ladakhi Pashmina growers in Changtang, and to support the Changtang Pashmina Growers Cooperative, we are promoting this insulation rather than synthetic ones like rock wool or glass wool. This is zero emission, carbon neutral, produced with love by herders in Changtang region of Ladakh. So now, once the ice is collected and safely packed in the drum, Thupstan, our teammate, is the team leader to carry it as a courier of ice from Khardungla to Dharamsala. So we are starting with electric bicycles this time as another clean mode of transport. So Thupstan is going on his electric bicycle. After traversing the Khardungla slopes on electric bicycles, the ice drum finally reaches the town of Leh, where it is mounted on a public transport, and our team takes it through the mountains of Ladakh and then entering Kashmir. Finally reached the Patni Top Hills near Jammu, where they parked for the night, keeping the ice cool by evaporative cooling by wrapping a wet towel around the ice drum. The next day, the ice drum is mounted on electric cars. This time it's a Hyundai Kona, which was generously supported by the company, and then it is brought down the slopes of the Patni Hills to Jammu city, where a second ice drum for backup just in case on the treacherous roads from Ladakh to Jammu anything happens. This backup ice drum came by air from Leh to Jammu, and this ice drum was carried by me on another electric car, provided pro bono by Tata Motors, the Nexon. Here we are securely seated, the holy ice from the glaciers of Kardungla, and we are ready to go to Pathankot and then Dharamsala. The two cars then traveled together from Jammu to Pathankot and through the plains of Punjab, the heat of roughly 40 plus degrees, and then slowly entered the hills of Himachal Pradesh, finally arriving at Dharamsala McLeodganj on the evening of 21st. Thank you. Sorry, very happy that we are here, arrived safely with the ice from the Kardungla Glacier to be presented to His Holiness. Your Holiness Chaksal, today, Your Holiness, on this Earth Day, we have brought a very special sacred piece of ice from the Kardungla Glacier to highlight the state of Kardungla Glacier in Ladakh. Your Holiness, our team from Ladakh brought this to you to highlight the urgency of climate change in the Tibetan Plateau from Ladakh to Lhasa to Tawang. And we believe that this is more than a piece of ice. It's a message, Your Holiness. Up in the high Himalayas, our glaciers are melting fast, leaving behind droughts and flash floods. The message on this Earth Day we want to convey to the world is to please live simply so that we in the mountains may simply live.
I really appreciate more and more people now really showing a sense of concern of world environment. So within my lifetime, in Lhasa area, annually winter on this mountain surrounding Lhasa, more snow. Then, year by year, less and less.
Of course. Yes, of course. Also because we should remember that the ice and the glaciers in Tibet melt twice as fast as in the rest of the world. I mean, the impact of climate change in those altitudes is twice as fast as in the rest of the earth. So imagine all the devastation we are experiencing in, for example, in Italy, we saw it last summer, but also elsewhere. Imagine this twice as fast, and this is what is happening in Tibet.
Yes.
So thank you for bringing this.
Yeah. And exactly, I think if we talk about climate issues, you see, we can talk about mitigation, about the targets, we can talk about the physics of climate change, we can talk about climate justice, also sort of technological solutions, you see, to solve the issue. I would like to talk about the aspect of adaptation. And I think just to tell you sort of an example how I experienced this adaptation. 4-5 years ago, I started a small project in Ladakh, and it was about supporting local farmers to grow something in this changing environment, also to give them a base for living, not to give up farming, maintain this natural environment, and also, yes, to earn money. And what we did was we brought some machines to Ladakh, and the idea was to set up a small muesli manufacture in factory in Ladakh, and take local food, fruits, barley, and so on, package, and then sell it in markets where they would earn a lot of money. So we did this, and we went to the local farmers and bought the barley and then packaged it, and then some of these packages even were brought to Switzerland, and we sold it in the shops and so on. So it was a very successful thing, and the people earned a lot. Then again, what happened was, and this is something that I realized only later, I was told after some weeks and months that the price for barley went up in Ladakh because we bought too much barley. For some people, it was good, for some people not, So it was actually a mistake, or something that we did not think of. And we did something, with good intentions, but actually it resulted in some huge problems for some other people, especially for the Tibetans who live in Choklamsa and do not have own barley fields or fields to grow something. When they went to the market, or to this farmer, he said, sorry, all my barley already went, to some other place. So what I would say is, if you talk about adaptations, you also have to go to this level, and understand the economic of local structures. You can't just do something. And in order to correct all these mistakes, there needs to be an environment where people can voice their concerns, talk to the officials, talk to the authorities, rethink their plans, and so forth. Now, if we look into Tibet, the situation there, the circumstances are quite similar, but the people have no saying about their future. It's all government regulated. If you speak up, you get in big troubles, and so the people in Tibet are deprived of their right to adapt to the climate change. I think it's clear that we can't, stop climate change. Climate change will happen. So I would say one of our main concerns should be, how can we adapt to this climate change in a way that people can make their own choices, be self-determined about their decisions, and so on. Just to sum up, it's an existential question, climate change. It's a political question, I would say. Democracy and free society helps, to adapt to climate change. And if we talk about climate change in context of Tibet, do not only think about the the physical effects of the glaciers for the billions of people and this and that. There is this other reality that we shouldn't forget. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wangpo. This is so important. Thank you also for having spoken about the mistakes, because even with the best intentions, sometimes we make mistakes. The important thing is to acknowledge that and then to try to recuperate. The most important thing is to provide a platform to hear the voices of the people, of the communities that are the stewards of their lands. And this is so, so important. More than, as I was also mentioning before, providing resources that sometimes can end up in not optimal results. You mentioned agriculture, by the way. I think this is an important track that should be followed. In these days in Sharm el-Sheikh, there is a big conversation on cuts of emissions, which of course is important, but agriculture is completely left aside from the conversation. We should mention that industrial agriculture amount between 40 to 50% of the global emissions, and this is not taken into consideration because industrial agriculture, of course, is based on fertilizers, which are based on fossil fuels. So this is an important issue that also we as Italian Buddhist Union are following very closely, but not just for our communities, for our movement of farmers, of small farmers who have the courage to go to regenerative organic agriculture, but we want to do this in a global way. I mean, creating alliances, of course, with India, of course, with Tibet, and of course, also with other countries such as Sri Lanka, etc. So we do think that we have a lot in common, and I hope this gathering is also an opportunity not just to highlight these issues, but also to create alliances and action that we can bring forward. So thank you so much. And let me introduce you the next speaker. Is Günther Cologna. Günther, I can't see much, so Günther, you're here. Günther, we switch in Italian, and I take advantage that we have these beautiful flyers, which is both in Italian, bilingual, and it's great. So it allows me to introduce you in the, if I do find it though, sorry. Here we are. Günther Cologna, I think all of you know him.
So Günther Cologna, I think you all know him. He is the head of Department Education and Training, Europe Research, a center dedicated to energy, environmental, health and social issues based in Bolzano. He is a member of the board of directors of the International Tibet Network. If I'm not mistaken, you've also been the translator of texts of His Holiness. So thank you for your contribution. And you are also in other boards. Oh, Association Italy-Tibet, of course. So thank you so much for being with us. Günther, I give you the floor.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I was a member of the organizing committee for this dialogue for the future that Wangpo talked about, and you saw a clip in the beginning. So the dialogue was started, and it was required by His Holiness years back, and then the pandemics took place. And so we shifted it. Last spring, we celebrated it on the Earth Day in April in Dharamsala. This dialogue that the Dalai Lama wanted is a dialogue with scientists, activists, but also people with decision-making powers, politicians, basically, also with and also Tibet supporters, of course. In 2 days, we covered several different topics. One is the importance of Tibet, and you, Silvia, already said a few things, especially about the importance of this reservoir of water. The roof of the world is the water tower of Asia. More than 2 billion people live thanks of this water. They need this water to grow the food that they eat. So it's crucially important for a large percentage of the population. You also said that the higher up you go, the faster the temperature goes up and the faster the ice melts. When you read about the target of 1.5 degrees of global warming, that's an average. It doesn't mean that it should be 1.5 degrees worldwide. It could be 1 degree at sea level, but it could be a lot more, as in fact is, the higher you go in terms of altitude. As Silvia mentioned, I work for a research institute. We study the Alps, and the same phenomenon is taking place there. So this acceleration in the ice melting is more severe in the mountains. And the effects will be the same here, because you have springs of rivers up in the mountains. If the level of water of the Po River has gone down, as we saw this year, this is also due to this faster melting. Of course, the poor rainfall and the poor snowfall in the previous winters play a role. Also, in the Alps, also in Alto Adige, we boast about our hydroelectric power plants because it's clean energy, because we thought it was renewable energy. But if you have little snow and if the glaciers are melting away because they provide the water to feed the turbines, also this clean source of energy is not so sustainable for the future. We have to think about it. In Tibet, the Chinese built many dams to reach the target of 1.5 degrees. So the water is there, the difference in altitude is there, so it seemed to be a solution. But if the glaciers melt, it's going to be a problem, because we will not have the water that's required to generate electricity. In the video, we saw His Holiness the Dalai Lama. His Holiness has always been very aware, even back in time when nobody was. He's also been very much aware of the importance of the environment and environmental protection. And it's also part of Buddhist values. I'm not an expert on Buddhism, but there are a few words, a few values that I would like to rely on for my discussion. First of all, interdependence, which is one of the key concepts in Buddhism. There is also interdependence between us humans and the environment. If the environment suffers, this has an impact on us too. So also the use of resources, or rather the use of sources, is important. And we use too much of that. We are overusing our resources or sources. Normally, in midsummer, you read on the papers, today we've reached the Earth Overshoot Day. I don't know how to say it in Italian, but anyway, the concept is that we have a quantity, a limited quantity of resources available, water, earth, or land. Everything is limited, and we consume every year the resources available in that year. We exhaust that amount of resources by the end of August. This phenomenon has been going on for decades. In the 1970s, the resources were still enough for the whole year. Now we've reached a level whereby at the end of August, we've already exhausted our credit, so to speak. From then on, we are in debt with nature. This means that we're stealing resources away from the next generation. So we are taking away resources from our children, but also from others, because not everyone has the same power to access resources. So the strongest, the richest get access to resources. Those who are not will be left without. It's fundamental for us to consider this. Another point The first time I read about this topic and the Dalai Lama wrote about the environment, the first time I read about it, it was in the peace plan with the 5 points of 1987. And this peace plan, His Holiness asked that this area becomes a Ahimsa area, an area of peace and non-violence, an area of environmental protection, like a natural park, aware that Tibet was really important for all the surrounding countries downstream the roof of the world. So a sort of buffer area that would allow everyone to get access to resources without anyone being able to overuse the resources. Then His Holiness wrote a lot more on this topic, but let's continue with values. So interdependence is first, non-violence, of course, non-violence also with regard to animals. His Holiness always talks about animals and plants and not just humans. Then there is compassion. And we can extend the value to another fundamental concept for His Holiness, which is universal responsibility. Also, in this respect, we've seen terrible floods in Pakistan this year. More than 30 million people had their houses flooded, the fields were flooded, livestock died, taken away by floods, killed by water, basically. But Pakistan is a country that emits very little CO2. So it's a country that does not contribute or only contributes to a minor extent to global warming, but is suffering the consequences of it. Same is true for Pacific Islands. They are so flat that if the level of the sea increases just by a few meters, they will be flooded. They will lose their houses because their land will be overflooded. So it's also a question of our own responsibility. During COP27, they are talking about issuing or financing or funding adaptation measures. But very often you have the feeling that it's just a fig leaf, so that we Western countries can continue to live as we've done so far. So the issue of compassion and universal responsibility, as Wangpo said before, is part of environmental and social justice. I made an example of a country that did not cause the situation we are in, but they're still paying the cost of it, and even more than other countries. Also, the issue of drought in Kenya, where it hasn't rained for 4 years and animals are dying. Kenya didn't do anything to cause that. Kenya is entirely rural. It's, wilderness and pure nature in pristine state, but they're still suffering the consequences of this phenomenon. So we have to rethink everything. And then in a few days, the coming week, we will reach the threshold of 8 billion inhabitants living on Earth. This means that we have to think of everyone. We cannot just try to save our own lives. And then there are millions of other people who would not have the same benefits as us. And why His Holiness is always very trustful. He has trust in young people. You probably saw his dialogue with Greta Thunberg a couple of years ago. He hopes very much that young people will have the strength and the impact that's required to change the way we live and the way we've affected climate worldwide. I work for a research institute where we monitor evolution, we study the data, and unfortunately, I'm not as trustful in a quick change as His Holiness. For instance, this year we will reach the peak of CO2 emissions. So while a few years ago, because of the pandemic, we had a minor decrease, we're back on the upside. We're again increasing the emissions. And all the targets to reach half by 2030 and reach the level of zero emissions by 2050. We cannot wait a month before 2030 or a month before 2050 to reach the target. If we want to get there, we should see a steep decline in the curve right now, whereas it's still increasing. Another element, well, of course, there are many hurdles to that, and I realize it. Not even politicians are signing these agreements who talk about percentages. They don't even realize. We often, to define the ages of the Earth, we often use the material that was dominating the Iron Age, for instance. Now we are in the age of plastics and glass and a lot more. All these substances need a lot of energy generated from fossil fuels. So fossil fuels are necessary in order to produce them. It's not that we are going to live in wooden huts with straw roofs. So we need to be able to generate energy, not with gas or coal or other fossil fuels. We will have to find the way to generate the energy that we need with the strength of wind, through the sun, and other things, but we still are not there. But the efforts must be made along that path, in that direction. But you know, there are many, many hurdles. The first climate conference was in Rio 30 years ago. From then on, countries started to think for the first time about how to counter global warming and climate change. So there is awareness, and many other conferences took place, Kyoto, Paris, and then a COP conference every year lately. But the curve has always gone up and hasn't gone down. And there is this idea of sustainable growth, but growth is not sustainable, because if we use resources, you know, there may be sustainable development, but not sustainable growth. The Club of Rome already wrote a report on this back in the 1970s, so there is awareness that we cannot continue to grow sustainably. But there are obstacles. So we live with glass, steel, concrete. So it's not easy to change overnight. That's one point. And then the oil companies in the last 50 years have made $3 billion in profits every day, per day. So nobody wants to kill the golden cow. So in the last years, we've seen campaigns to discredit scientists, to warn about climate change. We've seen corruption, we've seen politicians being bribed to support that it was all fantasy, you know, the climate has changed in the past, and so we shouldn't do anything to change it. There's no reason to stop using petrol or gas. And we see it right now in Sharm el-Sheikh. More than 600 delegates from oil companies are registered. We just have 4 Tibetans there. So look at the imbalance that is there. Those who defend the environment and environmental justice and environmental rights are just few who shout, but unfortunately don't have a lot of means to make their voice heard, despite all the energy, dedication, and faith but the opposite interests are so many. And also in that context, something has to change. The first Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Trump administration was a former CEO of Shell, the biggest oil company in the world. He would certainly not think about green policies. He was appointed to that office to defend someone's interests. So with all the love and dedication that we feel to His Holiness and with all respect for his trust, I can say that there is still a long way to go. There are many obstacles and we're still on the wrong way. Thank you. Thank you, Günther. We have a few minutes before a short break. And I would like to go back to a couple of points that you mentioned. First of all, I'd like to remind also those of you who are following from home that on the occasion of the last Earth Day in April, when the piece of ice was brought to His Holiness and all these conversations took place, also a manifesto was produced. So you can find the manifesto online. It's extremely interesting. It has a number of points, and I invite you all to go and look at the manifesto. Thank you for also reminding us about the role that Buddhism can play within the environmental issue. You talked about interdependence. I would also say, let's think of how the very essence of Buddhism leads us to have a revolutionary vision that we desperately need at this time with regard to ecology. In other words, the model that took us here until today is an anthropocentric model where humans exploit resources, has a vision of domain and ownership and property based on non-separation, on non-duality. Conversely, Buddhism offers a different approach, ecocentric approach, where we are part of nature. Humans are just one species in nature. So I believe that Buddhism has a lot to offer, and on top of that, it has its own revolutionary uniqueness that we so desperately need right now. And what you said about growth, which cannot be sustainable, takes me back to the documentary that Wangpo showed today that reminds us that we should live simply so that we can simply live. If we continue to consume and follow a consumerist model, there will always be someone else who will not be able to simply live. There will be people who will not be allowed to survive. His Holiness often repeats this concept. Politics are very important, and we should continue to do political advocacy. But our action together with other 10 people, 100 people, 1,000 people can start to make a difference. So our lifestyle really matters. And then you reminded the political process, COP, and the conventional parties on climate. And you reminded us of how the convention has been there since 1992 and was signed in Rio. Let me just remind you that last year, during COP26, it took 26 conferences. It was only last year that the term fossil fuels was introduced in some of the decisions, which are not binding, by the way. It's the first time after 26 COPs, the first time that the word was included in the text. And you said that the fossil fuel providers and exploiters delegation is the biggest delegation. There is no bigger delegation in terms of governmental agencies than the delegation of fossil fuel industries. Now, the point about optimism, I like to to repeat what Michael said yesterday, selective hope, I love that. We will be able to convince, we will be able to do some activist initiatives only when we are ready for what we think is unforeseeable today. So we should also open up to the idea that a change is really possible and feasible. I agree, these meetings, these COPs are very often just empty words, but they have a benefit and a merit to at least allow environmental defenders to create alliances. This movement is gaining momentum more and more. So as Gianna Messi said, we can talk about an active hope, not something that we just wait to come from above, but something that we are ready to act upon. Now we are going to take 15 minutes break so that we can, stretch our legs, and we will reconvene in 15 minutes. Thank you. Our morning session. So please kindly make your way back to the room. I think we can start.
And welcome back also to all those who are following us streaming via Facebook and YouTube channel of the Italian Buddhist Union. We are talking about the environmental concerns on the Tibetan Plateau, and we have already discussed some of the key topics, and now we are entering also a conversation on the importance of advocacy. And we will do that with Kai Mueller. Kai is the executive director of the International Campaign for Tibet in Germany. You're based in Berlin. And before joining the ICT, you acted as executive director, of course, of ICT. Before joining ICT, you served on the board of Amnesty International Germany. Once again, how environment and human rights are extremely connected. And since 2015, you are in charge also of coordinating the activities for the UN. And you have been a research associate at the German Parliament. So you are, I think, the best placed person to talk about political advocacy. Let me say only a few things. We were talking before about our lifestyle, the very fact that they live simply so that others can simply live. It is extremely important. Also, political advocacy is extremely important. I just want to mention one thing, that how, all the system of measuring our footprint, do you know who created this system? It was BP, the petroleum company, the British Petroleum, in order to divert, the issue, the responsibility, the attention from the company to the people, as if the people were responsible for, on a personal level, for climate change. So I think we need, and I think the work you do, Kai, is extremely important in this regard, to keep focus and not be distracted by companies, in this case, that want us to believe that we are the responsible for. Our lifestyle is important. And of course, we need to do our best to reduce our footprint. However, we should keep government accountable for the promises they make and the companies accountable for the pollution they produce. So, Kai, over to you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think you said something very important, accountability. And it's accountability of governments, of international institutions, and in our case of the Chinese government with regard to their policies that matter for tackling climate change. And in that context, it's important that human rights have a voice, particularly with regard to Tibet, but also beyond. And I just wanted to follow up on what Günther Cologna said with regard to the COP27 and the presence of the corporations there. We as a civil society organization, one needs accreditation, and this accreditation is granted by the United Nations bodies. So it is for us extremely difficult to get such accreditation for these important conferences. In fact, ICT, the International Campaign for Tibet, applied twice for such accreditation. Both times it was rejected on the grounds that our mandate and our work would not give enough evidence, credible evidence for our environmental and climate change related work. This is of course quite unacceptable, given the fact that then it seems to be rather natural and easy for such corporations to be present there. So if you look at our Tibetan presence in Egypt right now, thankfully some colleagues of ours, of other Tibet organizations, friends of ours are present there, but none of them have got formal accreditation. They and we rely on the actual generosity of other NGOs who take us under their wings. And this means also actually that we do not have the same opportunities. We cannot organize things, side events or co-organized events inside the venue, which is important for access. So this limits our work there a great deal. So this is also a reality I think needs to be more acknowledged, and I think it's striking how much present for the climate, if you will put it drastically, criminals, as some call them, are being granted there. So that about COP27, we'll be present there. We work on these issues. We have been working on these issues a great deal, and I think what Wangpo Tethong presented is part of it. The movie you've seen has displayed, engagement, activism of Tibetans in exile in this case, or Wangchuk, who took this very impressive bit of ice, of glacier ice, to Dharamsala on Earth Day, and the way he did it, I found it quite impressive actually. So careful, so mindful of how things are being done. So I can just applaud this. And this is what we want to, at ICT, highlight. We want to highlight also the activism, the engagement of Tibetans, particularly also in Tibet, who want to be masters of their own environment in this case, who want to have a say in their immediate environment, in how the land is being treated, and how resource extraction happens. So we want to highlight through that Tibetans are not pawns in a game. Perhaps some of you have seen maybe the scenes from Ukraine last night, from Kherson, the place that got liberated, people crying in tears, chanting, singing, dancing. It is remarkable, and this is a reminder of what freedom is about. It's not about a big chess board where big powers are pushing around so-called little people with no ambition, no rights, across just to their liking. It is about people who want to be the masters of their own fate, and this is what I think is important in the Tibetan case, that we are looking, we have to acknowledge, we have to pay attention to what is going on the ground. What are Tibetans' aspirations? What are they willing to sacrifice? What kind of risks are they taking? Much more risks than we do. That must be clear. Tibetans who protest, or not even protest in that sense, but who stick their heads out, who are community leaders, who are working against poaching, for example, who want to protect the land from extractive mining. It is not that much political in a sense, but in another way it is, of course. But it's people who care about where they live, who care about nature and also their culture, because nature is part of culture. And that's particularly true for Tibetans. That having said, I have prepared a little presentation for you. I hope it's not too dry in a sense, because it comes from an advocacy background. We're talking a great deal to governments about what they should be doing. We describe the situation, of course. We collate information, we analyze it, but then we also ask governments, or urge governments better, to become active, to do something about it, not just listen to us, but they need to do something. So this is a little bit legal. There's a lot of legal reference perhaps at the end, so forgive me about that. So what we have published this year in June actually is a report on Tibetan environmental defenders of Tibet. That's the title. And in fact, we felt such a report was necessary, because in our perspective, it got overlooked. What actually, what is the common feature of a great deal of Tibetans who are persecuted for their local activism. So we came up with this report. So I want to lead you through this. This has got more or less two parts. One is actually I would like to talk a little bit, set the scene a little bit. Obviously it's now today 13 November. First I would like to set the scene, and secondly talk a little bit about our report. So many of you are familiar with Tibet. Quick refresher: these are the boundaries of Tibet, and consists of Amdo, Kham, Utsang generally. So we need to be clear about the fact that Tibet is not the Tibet Autonomous Region. So just as a reminder, it's much more. And you see that is a huge part of what the CCP controls today, the landscape, the land. So sorry, here got lost here. So and it corresponds largely with the Tibetan Plateau, not entirely, but largely. So the next. So couple of buzzwords, which most of you know. Tibet is the third pole. You can see this is true because it contains the largest volume of frozen water outside the polar regions. It plays a critical role and source and channel for distributing water, nutrition, temperature flows to the wider region. It holds the largest volume of frozen fresh water outside the polar regions. And you see that it is also the source of Asia's major rivers. Approximately, and here comes a figure, 14.5% of the world's glaciers are located in Tibet. Another buzzword, Asia's water tower. As I mentioned, the originating of the rivers there. Indus, Ganges, Yarlung Tsampo, Brahmaputra, Irrawaddy, Salween, Mekong, Yangtze, and Yellow River. Forgive me if I quote the most common names. They all have Tibetan names, of course. But you may recognize Mekong, Irrawaddy, Yangtze, and so forth more easily. About 1.4 billion people rely on the water from the Tibetan Plateau to sustain their livelihoods, and a further 40% of the world's population rely on its ecosystem services, which includes the distribution of water, nutrition, temperature flows, and to an extent, the generation of the East Asian and South Asian monsoons. So, oops, here we are. I'm sorry, yeah. Sorry, I had skipped this one. So here we are. Here you can see, the distribution of water and the Tibetan rivers originating in Tibet. So what does climate change mean for Tibet? As has been said, the Tibetan Plateau is a climate hotspot. It is undergoing rapid climate change due to its high sensitivity to global warming. Records show that it is warming at least twice as fast as the global average, at least, as its high altitude and reflective snow and ice cover accelerate the warming effects of rising air pollution and grassland degradation. If we are able to limit global warming 1.5 degrees Celsius, scientists predict 36% of the glaciers along the Hindu Kush and Himalayan range will be gone by 2100. If emissions are not cut, then at least 66% of the glaciers will be gone in 80 years. Such glacial melt will not only affect river flow, but global warming is also expected to increase the frequency and intensity of extreme weather conditions such as snowstorms, floods, and droughts, as well as increase biodiversity loss across the plateau. Paying attention to this region of the world and how it is changing under climate change is therefore absolutely crucial. Not only because Tibetans are sounding the alarm and being persecuted for it, but also because what happens to the plateau ecosystem has enormous consequences for downstream countries. The recent floods in Pakistan, which have already been mentioned, is one clear reminder of why we need to pay attention to this regional ecosystem. So now, quite important, Tibet's resources, because it gives us an insight into the motivation of the Communist Party's policies. When we think of Tibet, it's important to recognize Tibet is perceived as a frontier region that is of high priority for China's basic security. It therefore needs to be controlled, and if value can be extracted, then it must be maximized. So what we have seen is a strategy to re-engineer Tibet's landscape to, one, render the frontier region and specifically its people governable by removing Tibet's nomad populations of the grasslands and trying to turn them into so-called productive Chinese workers who display Chinese traits and preferences and are loyal to the CCP. Second, extract as much productive value from the land in the form of resource extraction. And you can see, the minerals, the amount of a number of mining sites in Tibet, and the vast resources that can be extracted there. So I want to set the scene and finish setting the scene here with another very specific development, and that is relocation of nomads and nature reserves. And under the guise, and this is very important for us to understand, of nature and biodiversity conservation, the Chinese government has established a system of nature reserve which covers 15.1% of the land surface under control of the Communist Party. The Qinghai Tibetan region accounts for 61.2% of the reserve area. In these areas, in particular the Sangchuan, Hochil and Changtang area, hundreds of thousands of Tibetans have been relocated. When you look at the image here, you can see that large chunks of Tibet are being removed of Tibetans and turned into national parks and restricted areas. But in reality, there is a mismatch in the nature reserve network and biodiversity representation. In addition, according to research, China's system of natural reserves primarily focus on mammal and bird protection, but lack adequate attention to plants, amphibians, and reptiles, which would be something perhaps the Tibetans living there would know better. The 47 nature reserves in Tibet have largely focused on the Changtang Plains, which make up 25% of the local plateau area, and only 10% of the species. In contrast, the Himalayan and Hengduan Mountains regions account for 20% of the total area and contain over 80% of the species. So now, now that I've outlined a little bit the context, and promise I'll be a little bit less dense here. We know now where the geography of Tibetans, where Tibetans live, where major mountains and rivers are, and the types of resources and also restrictions that characterize the landscape. Is this context in which Tibetan environmental defenders operate or show their activism? I would like to begin the topic of environmental defenders with an introduction to Kunchok Jinpa's and Karma Sandrup's stories. Through their stories, I want to highlight some of the environmental issues concerning Tibet, as well as the types of persecution Tibetans confront. I want to then explain why the plight of Tibetan environmental defenders are so often invisible in the international community and why it was important to report to their plight now. As a child, Kunchok Jinpa was a monk. He traveled to India in 1989, where he studied for 18 months in a monastery, then for 5 years as a lay student at the TCV schooling system. He also undertook tertiary studies at the Higher Tibetan Studies Institute in India. He returned to Tibet in 1998 and worked as a tour guide. He shared information with foreign media about environmental and political protests in Jeeru County in the so-called TAR. He was officially arrested in 2013 in November at the age of 43. He was sentenced to 21 years of imprisonment for leaking state secret, an incredibly harsh sentence. When protests broke out in May 2013, as said, against a planned mining on a sacred mountain called Nakla Dzamba, Kunchok shared info with foreign media. So that's what got him the prison sentence. Moments before Kunchok Jinpa was arrested, he posted a message on his WeChat, Chinese Twitter account. It said, "I am now at the bank of a river. There are many people behind me watching me, and I'm sure to be arrested. Even if they arrest me, I'm not afraid. Even if they kill me, I have no regrets. But from now on, I will not be able to give reports. If there's no word from me, that means I've been arrested." Sadly, 8 years after, he died in prison while serving his 21-year prison sentence. He died in a hospital in Lhasa less than 3 months after being transferred there from prison without his family knowing about it. Local sources said he suffered from a brain hemorrhage and was paralyzed. Now another story. Kama Sandrup, a businessman, award-winning conservationist and anti-poaching community leader who co-founded the Qinghai Three River Environmental Protection Group, a group who was awarded actually by Chinese-governed NGOs themselves. So he got recognition in the Chinese society even for his work, but that did not keep the authorities from persecuting him. What was his problem? It was poaching. It's quite common that local Tibetans protest against poaching through local authorities, and oftentimes local authorities are in a corruption scheme with those poachers. So it is not really, to put it like that, in the interest of the authorities that this poaching stops, and anybody who goes against this becomes a target of persecution. So this is what happened to him. He was detained in 2010. He was charged for 15 years, to a prison sentence of 15 years, allegedly for grave robbing. So a very, very, peculiar charge he got. He was also targeted because he defended his brothers. So it's oftentimes friends and family who join in those protests. So you can see that people like him draw community support, and that in itself is also a problem for the party. So why are these people so invincible? I mean, we hear about them as people who support Tibet and care about the human rights of Tibetans. Now, just a couple of figures. For example, Global Witness, an NGO which documents the abuse of land environmental defenders, reported 1,540 land and environmental defenders were killed globally between 21 and 20. In 2019, approximately 40% of the 304 rights defenders killed were environmental defenders, but Tibetans are not counted in either of these statistics. Tibetans are not counted because they are made invisible by the Chinese state. The Chinese state labels all Tibetan grievances and activism, including environmental activism, as political and separatist activity. Tibetans are labeled political dissidents and charged with criminal offenses such as endangering state security. But to look at a more positive, optimistic side, there are new opportunities in international law. There have been major developments in the recognition of the right to a safe, clean and healthy environment, as well as a serious recognition of the impacts of climate change on human rights. As highlighted by the Special Rapporteur on Environment, Dr. Boyd, an independent expert for the UN, while legally not binding, such formal recognitions of the right can serve as a catalyst for change in countries, such as efforts to enshrine the right in constitution and legal regional treaties. This would allow people to challenge environmentally destructive policies under human rights legislation. The creation of a United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Climate Change in March 2022 was also a recognition of the relationship between climate change and human rights. And I want to underline, it was civil society, global civil society, among them also Tibet advocacy groups, that pushed states to recognize and to establish these kind of instruments at the United Nations level. They did not come from states. I would be very clear about this, but this had required a years-long activism by a global coalition of rights groups. So there are many other angles that are possible, some conventions which we are referring to when we raise these cases. Now, I think am I good in time? 2 minutes, okay. Yes, I would just briefly refer to the report. The report is available on www.safetibet.org, our website, and it contains the case of 50 persecuted Tibetan environmental defenders since 2008. I must say there must be or should be many more such cases which we do not know of because of the lack of access to Tibet. So what we hear is maybe just the tip of the iceberg, or maybe the larger part of the iceberg. We don't know that, but there are many more, probably many more of such Tibetans who engage themselves. Most of the reasons, the overwhelmingly prominent reason for protests is against mining. So more than 50% of these individuals have, in one way or the other, protested against mining that was targeting sacred landscape, for example. See, for example, the case of Günther, who was protesting against this or working to get information on this outside of Tibet. And there are also incidents of protests against the industrial meat production. I would underline meat production, industrial meat production. Yeah, so not just having meat per se, but against the way the industrial, production of foodstuff and such. So we could speak also a little bit about environmental defenders, their definition. I would like to skip that. What happens to them is, of course, detentions, lengthy detentions. We have, here you see again, these little statistics. Unfortunately, we have had some cases of deaths in or after custody. Some have been disappeared, whereabouts not known. These are treatments that I've touched on already. They are being politicized, most of the times being labeled as separatists or splittists. And here you see an analysis of the prison sentences, which are around about the average of 9 years. So it's pretty tough. It's pretty harsh, and also given the conditions in Chinese prisons. So here you see some, and I would invite you to consult our report, some quotes of people, of experts who lament this situation, who lament the ignorance of the Chinese government and the Chinese authorities of Tibetan knowledge of the land, of the environment. So our recommendations are, we want governments, of course, to press the Chinese government to uphold its human rights obligations, but we also, and I close with that, would like governments to raise these cases in their bilateral climate-related dialogues with the Chinese government. It is utterly important that these human rights of Tibetans, or participatory rights of Tibetans, knowledge of Tibetans, it is very important that this is being protected also in these dialogues, because we know human rights are not just a bonus, or participatory rights on achieving climate protection. They are an integral part of it. without local knowledge, measures may most certainly fail. And this is something that governments need to consider and bear in mind and raise with the Chinese government. Otherwise, their approach to climate protection is not the correct one. And one last thing is, what we noticed is that governments tend to give what we say in human rights issues, Tibet, Xinjiang, wherever, they tend to allow a climate rebate, that's how we call it, for human rights issues for the Chinese government. So for the sake of having dialogue on climate change, governments tend to be quiet on human rights issues because they are being perceived as sensitive. And this is a very, very negative approach, a very, very destructive approach, I believe, because the Chinese government is not acting like that. So we want to make sure that Tibetans' rights are part of the deal, are part of the conversation between governments and on a UN level. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kai. I think your last point on, thank you for producing this report, actually, for publishing it. What I think is extremely important when you say on bilaterals, including the bilaterals that are going to take place this week, actually, in Sharm el-Sheikh at the COP, sometimes the governments just mention human rights, so it's something that they have done, right? So they are obliged, sort of obliged, to mention, okay, we have concerns about the human rights dimension in China, not necessarily distinguishing China and Tibet, as we were discussing yesterday, and they are done. And then let's talk about business. I think the value of this report is precisely providing a face, a name behind the so-called human rights violations. Okay, the general human rights violations. And if our countries, if our government can mention name and surname, and the life of these people is different, because China knows that we are acting also as a watcher of what's going on in Tibet. In the occupied territory of Tibet. So thank you so much for this. I think it has an incredible value for this kind of conversation. I would like to give the floor to Professor Francesca Tarocco. She is a professor of Buddhist studies and Chinese religions. She is the director of the new Institute Center for Environmental Humanities, NISH, at the University of Ca' Foscari in Venice. With Francesca, we have a strong collaboration, and including between the Italian Buddhist Union and NISH, including through the agenda of the ecological agenda of the Italian Buddhist Union, which I invite you also to visit a website, social media, etc. We are doing quite a lot of work also on the non-human dimension, which I know it's very dear to you as well, because it is at the very basis, I think, of Buddhism, the care not for human beings, but also for non-human beings, for all sentient beings. We just had an event organized by the ecological agenda of the Italian Buddhist Union together with Dr. Jane Goodall, which was called Sentient Beings, precisely to underline the non-separation, the non-duality between the human species and the other species that populate our planet, our Mother Earth, and our planet. But not only non-human beings, but also, you know, we are talking about mountains, rivers, oceans having their own rights to exist, the intrinsic right to exist. And I think this is a very Buddhist concept. I don't know, Francesca, if you, I think you agree with this, but I really would like to hear from you. You have an incredible expertise on Buddhism, on Chinese religions, and we are very much looking forward to hearing what you have prepared for us today. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Silvia. This is always wonderful to be in front of people and thinking, oh gosh, what's going to happen next now? And to be the last speaker indeed is even more daunting when, you know, my colleagues in fact have said so much. And indeed, many of the things that I wanted to discuss today have already been covered so beautifully by others. But following up from what Silvia says, I think, you know, primarily the reason why I am here is to represent a sort of new approach that we are taking, that many scholarly communities are taking towards this thing that we call the environment. And if I may have my, the pointer, please, yes. So perhaps we can just show a few slides here. So I am not, I do not come from Tibetan studies. My engagement with Tibet, and you know, perhaps before showing you the other slides, I will just tell you a little bit about myself. And I'll just show you one picture, a few pictures in fact. Yes, so as a young woman, in fact, as I was training, you know, learning classical Chinese and Buddhist texts, studying Buddhist texts in Chinese mostly and in Sanskrit, I also traveled. I traveled a lot in the northern part of Sichuan and province, so in Amdo, in Kham, in Qinghai. So those years in my early 20s were really marked by the encounter with Tibetans and with the Tibetan Plateau. And at that time, really, what, you know, not very many young people went there, particularly not from Europe. We had the luck of having, you know, long visas and the paperwork that sort of allowed us most of the time. Sometimes we actually, you know, trespassed illegally, and of course we were also occasionally, you know, asked to go back or even arrested. I somewhere in a, you know, in a tiny provincial official, there's probably, you know, an archive with my, you know, declaration of having breached Chinese law. And that at that time, in fact, what was emerging as a very important issue was logging, and that's something that I experienced, you know, in my travels a lot, and the extraction that Kai is talking about, just mentioned in his reports, and that the sort of the activism against that sort of extraction that is still characterizing, you know, the sort of state approach to this part of the world was becoming very strong. And my other engagement has been through, with the Tibet, has been through cultural, contemporary culture. And this is a beautiful film. I was very honored to be, you know, in Shanghai when the film was presented at New York University, where I used to work. This is Pema Tseden film, Tarlo, The One Who Lives. It was one of the first films that actually got national distribution in Chinese, Tibetan language films, and the film encapsulates, you know, this is a rather, you know, a very different landscape from what you just saw. It's a very subtle to Italian eyes, of course, this is kind of, the black and white is a reminder of neorealism, neorealist films. It's a very stark, harsh environment in which a pastoralist, as we hear, a shepherd, tries to make sense of a world that is changing around him, and the director captures that very well. He does not romanticize in any way Tibet or Tibetans, and the main character is a simple man, and the power of the film comes from sort of showing that the landscape and the waterscape are changed dramatically through infrastructural intervention. And infrastructural intervention is definitely one of the themes that we need to discuss here. But at the same time, I think, and I do not want to strike a too optimistic accord, but we do need to bear that in mind. Many people within China are sympathetic to Tibet, and there are indeed communities of practitioners and scholars and so on that are trying to think with the environment and with the changes that modernization and this sort of infrastructural managerial approach to the land is determining. So I had similar remarks here, so I'm just going to go fairly quickly through the first slides because you have heard that from others. But yes, so to think about the Tibetan Plateau is to think about water, is to think about ice, and is to think about, some people now use the term, hydroscape. I've used the term, waterscape, hydroscape. So, in fact, this is, as we have already mentioned, it's not a local issue. This is a planetary issue. Of course, the numbers are really high. The numbers are really high of people who are involved, who are as you see, this is one of the most densely populated parts of the world, and climate change is causing Tibet's glaciers to melt. And these are, this fact has enormous implication for Tibetans themselves, but also probably about, roughly 2 billion people, who live downstream. So this is a planetary issue, and it is one that needs to be tackled in a very different way, or perhaps, in fact, what's emerging here in this conversation as well, in a multiplicity of way, the engagement needs to be multivocal and indeed global. So again, there are geopolitical and several other issues that we have discussed, not least, how the Tibetan Plateau is understood by the various governments that are involved in these conversations. There's a massive doubt about these sort of intergovernmental dialogues and the efficacy of these intergovernmental dialogues, particularly with regards to the issue of damming. Now, it is a truism that that China has a very strong engineering approach to climate change. It is many of the people who run the country indeed are engineers by training, and some of the largest dams in the world are being built in China as we speak. So there's quite a lot going on right now. The Indian government and the Bangladeshi government, of course, are worried. They are worried about things like the immediate impact of some of these dams, but they're also worried about things like water transfer or tunneling and the possibility, to put it in very stark ways, that eventually China may want to close the tap. Yeah, so that's that's something that, of course, with dire consequences for vast populations, as we said, from India to Bangladesh to Southeast Asia with the Mekong. Climate change is happening. The third pole, as we already heard, global warming is affecting the mountainous range of the Himalayas at a faster rate than anywhere else in the world, and the of course, we need a lot more research to understand this phenomenon. In fact, there is an increasing attempt to collaborate among Institute for Polar Studies and Glacial Studies, and to include, in fact, Tibet. We have one such center at Ca' Foscari, also run by Carlo Barbante, a colleague, an Italian colleague who is a specialist of Antarctica, but is in fact increasingly interested in understanding what is going on in Tibet. So, as I said, multivocal and multidisciplinary approach to the understanding of these phenomena. Let me just skip this. And yes. And what my center tries to do, and many other scholars are trying to do from a variety of disciplines in the humanities. Of course, we do need to collaborate with scientists. We know that very well, and scientists, I think, increasingly know that they need to collaborate with humanists. About what we're trying to do in our center from the perspective of what we call the environmental humanities is to think about the nature culture and the ontologies connected with nature culture in a very different way. And my particular approach is to think with ideas, practices, engagements, and conversations that are inspired by Buddhism, and that are also very much inspired in different ideas of what is sacred, what is transcendent, what is immanent, and what the relationship is between humans and non-humans. So here are some questions that we can that we try and throw into these conversations. Of course, as I said, involving as many people as possible inside and outside academia. So some of the questions that we try and ask, and I will just read them out for you. What forms of legal frameworks, such as environmental rights, animal rights, and the rights of nature are available? In the framework of considering the world as co-constructed by both humans and non-humans. How can sentience, the idea of sentience, be reconfigured as a form of rationality and relationality rather than an essence or capacity exclusive to humans? Right? How do we think with sentience? How do we think, with time, for instance, personality, personhood? How does one think about personhood and the formation of personhood in contexts that are non-human, as Silvia said, and this is one of the particular interests and particular forte of the research center in Venice. How do we think, for example, with water? What is the agency of water? How does water think? How does water act? How does water shape people and the landscape. Again, how do religious ideas of life and death ontologically frame the possibilities and impossibilities of being sentient? For grounding these issues, we believe with multi-species perspective of the sensorial, we can explore pathways toward ecological togetherness beyond the apocalyptic imagination of Anthropocene futures. Right, so one of the things for which we need to inspire ourselves and our conversation and all the people involved is, how do we move beyond the apocalypse? How do we move beyond this scenario that, of course, we need to bear in mind and we need to know very well, but how do we conceive of a future, beyond the Anthropocene, beyond the climate crisis? And here, I have just a few considerations, a few remarks to tell us, what it is to think with water. Water interlinks environmental, oceanic, and infrastructural history, and a deepening engagement with the materiality of water requires that we think about Tibet at large as a hydrological formation. So to think about, in a very different way about the history of Tibet and Tibetans, as co-creators of this place that is fundamentally a waterscape. And you see here, one of the many beautiful images to see that water is presented and represented as sentient, right? And as populated with beings, right? Water is populated with beings in traditional Tibetan iconography. And this is also something that increasingly is emerging in conversations at various levels, scientific, but also policy-making levels, and that is that Tibetan Buddhism is increasingly recognized as an important force in these conversations, and this is a map, indeed, of the many Buddhist monasteries that are scattered throughout the region, and their role, in fact, is being studied by many to understand what the relationship is between what we call, Buddhist practice and conservation, for instance. And this is not unique to Buddhism, of course, but Buddhism seem to do that very well. It happens with other sacred landscapes. It happens in Africa. It happens, of course, also in Europe and Latin America. That that religious communities seem to be doing really well in terms of actually, taking care and thinking with and practicing with what surrounds them. And there's this beautiful project of oral histories that have been collected, throughout the years on ideas of the environment and how these were transmitted before, in cultural terms, let's say, or in religious terms, ideas about the environment, ideas about the wholesomeness of the environment and the preservation of the environment, in traditional stories. So, for example, right, villagers in the Himalayan range would say, we should not cut trees because ing stays there, which will course us. The Naga lives in our rivers and waterholes, and if we disturb it, there won't be rainfall, and we will also give us health-related problems. So this idea that disturbance actually come from that there are religious and well-being consequences on committing such acts, right? That's one should act responsibly towards what surrounds us because there are actual real consequences, in one's lifetime and so on. So the idea of salvation is also connected with these particular actions. We should not disturb big mountains because Chen lives there and he also curse us, right? So these forms of storytelling, these forms of rationalization of the environment have been really useful and really important in people's lives for centuries. And in fact, a certain understanding, a certain repurposing even, of some of these stories is of crucial importance, I think, as we move forward to imagine place, right? What is place? How place making? How do people make place? How do people make sense of their lives, where lives initially and fundamentally are always, to live in a particular place and to make sense of it. So, as I said earlier, there are many studies, including among Chinese scholars, that that have found that that Buddhist monasteries are often an important driver of biodiversity and landscape conservation. And why? Because, of course, Buddhism is has a worldview that imbues natural formations with sacredness and the idea that that something needs to be treated well, in a sense, as part of a longer engagement with a mutual well-being and mutual co-constituency. And so this is, of course, understood very well by other trans-Himalayan religious contexts. So we should not forget that this is, a multi-religious environment, and indeed there are, stories and ways of making place that are common to the Himalayan region, and so also to other religious formations, and many places that are sacred to multiple religions in this context. And so this is a major opportunity, I think, for the environmental humanities to engage a place like Tibet, that is both, one of the critical zones of climate change, but also one of the richest in terms of, solutions, potential solutions in terms of, engagement with the land, understanding of the land, and understanding of water and waterscapes. I think this is my last slide. So. Again, we are at the end of this really important conversation, and I think that a moment ago I was talking to one of the masters here. The ethical dimension is certainly one that we need to remember and to bring to our own lives. But we also need to think about, someone uses the term, a wonderful environmental humanist, a colleague of mine uses the term radical hope. Yeah, radical hope. And I want to end with that note. I think that, in fact, all religions and Buddhism also teach us, that we need to live with others and indeed with other beings and with other forms of sentience in a hopeful an ethical manner. Thank you.
I think while we are talking about environmental concerns on the Tibetan Plateau, the subtitle should be Radical Hope. I really like that. Thank you for sharing this, Francesca, with us. I think every time we doubt something, we should go back to the inspiration of radical hope, which is not something that just happened, but it's something that we make happen. So thank you so much for that, and also for reminding us how the ecological crisis is also a spiritual crisis, and sometimes we say also a niche, a crisis of imagination. But sometimes when we propose this, it looks like something idealistic to the most cynical. It's not idealistic at all. It is happening. And I would like, the spiritual dimension is so important. The concept of non-duality is at the basis of the deep ecology that that provides the basis for the rights of nature. Rights of nature means recognizing that water, oceans, mountains, trees, and non-human animals, they do have rights, their own, okay? Not because they serve us, not because we need them, but because they have their own rights to exist, first of all, to exist. And it is happening in the world. It is happening in some constitutions. It is happening through rulings of, from rulings in India, for example, in New Zealand, in Australia, in the United States, in Latin America. It is happening. In Colombia, there are at least plus than 30 cases of recognition of rights of nature. And it's something that, the Tibetan knowledge holds for millennia or centuries and millennia. It's nothing new. It's just our colonialistic approach that didn't recognize that. So again, we go back to the idea that the legal system is not necessarily the system we are accustomed to. There is also a customary law that is treasured by the indigenous population around the world. And that's why we also need to provide voice to this population. We are here for this. I would invite Wangpo and Günther to come back for a session of questions and answers, if you can. So, and also I invite the audience to make questions if you do have questions. I would just like to ask Günther one thing, because we have heard today several times how climate change is happening faster in the Tibetan Plateau, but also you were mentioning in the Alps, for example. I'm very much a mountaineer woman, and I like to live in the mountains, and I could see from year after year how it changes. And it's not just a matter of aesthetics, it's really a matter that we ourselves in the, we are in Italy also encountering problems in terms of water. So I wanted to ask you about the permafrost issue, if you can give us some more details so that we better comprehend why the mountain environment is so fragile these days. Thank you.
Di nuovo in italiano. Ecco, sì. No, prima non avevamo parlato tanto di ghiacciai che si sciolgono.
I talked about the melting of glaciers, but there is also a dark side to glaciers that we don't see because it's underground. It's called permafrost. In Tibet, it's hundreds of thousands of square meters in size. Under the earth, under a couple of meters, we have earth, and underneath it's all ice. In the ice, there is a lot of organic mass entrapped in that ice, dead animals, dead plants, which once the permafrost melts, and with the increase of temperature this happens, this releases methane. And methane is much more powerful than CO2 as a gas. And this has a number of repercussions because it melts, the ice melts, becomes water, and it ends up underground. It moves underground, and it can cause landslides, snowslides. The ground moves. We have the same phenomenon. The Dolomites are not monolithic mountains. It's not one piece of rock. It's a number of rocks kept together by permafrost. It's like a glue. And when it melts, the mountains crumble. In Val Gardena, we had pieces of mountains that broke off the mountains because the permafrost melted. The higher the temperature is in summer, the more the phenomenon is visible. In Tibet, this may have a number of consequences that we cannot even imagine. The formation or release of methane is something we've seen. Also, the Iceman that you can find in a museum in Bozen, it's something that has come to the surface. It had been there for more than 5,000 years, but the ice melted and it came to the surface. In Siberia, they found mammoths that had been underground for a long time, and they came to the surface. There were phenomena where the earth gave way, a ravine broke up because the ice melted and the big hole opened up. This could become a problem for the Lhasa railway line. If the air melts, the tracks and the railway line may be sucked up into the earth. That's just a side note that I wanted to add. It's something that we don't see, it's underground, and we tend not to think about it, and it melts, as do the glaciers on the surface. That's extremely important, and thank you for sharing this. I'm asking the audience whether they have questions. Please raise your hands if you have questions. There is someone at the back of the room.
Good morning. First, thank you very much for all the presentation that are very well done and all those information that really deserve to be shared. I have a first question for Mr. Wangpo Tethong. In your presentation, you have shared the project in Ladakh of a cereal factory project and the downside of having one cereal market price increases, creating problem for other people. What kind of solution have you tried to apply, and was it successful?
Good. We talk about my mistakes. That's a good topic. Now, what we did, you see, finally, what we understood is we have to look at the supply side, yeah, and we have to increase actually the number of barley fields. You see, we can't take from the existing barley fields the barley and sell it somewhere else. You see, actually, it's quite easy, you see, to understand this mechanism, but we did not. We were just not careful enough. So in future, when we continue this project, I say because at the moment after the COVID situation, we had to make a stop, yeah. We would definitely look into the situation and try to encourage the farmer to have more barley fields. Saying this, I just want to remind you of my sort of argument, you see. In a society such as in India or in Ladakh or here in Italy or in Europe, we can make mistakes, you see. It's okay to make mistakes and then to correct, you see. But when we see these big dam projects, you see, the Communist Party of China doesn't make mistakes, you see, and would never admit to make mistakes. And this is, I think, a huge sort of danger and which lies in this combination of authoritarian rule regime plus this global challenge of climate change, and this must be seen. May I add one maybe sort of thought also, after listening to your presentation, I think what I really learned today is that we need to sort of have a more holistic approach to the issues, yeah. And then I also, you see, I think if we have this more holistic approach, we are in a better position to make good decisions. I would say if we have assembled here 5 years ago, we would have talked very differently about these topics here. we would have seen China or the development that we see there as a success story. Now, after this whole COVID issue, we see that they can't cope with the situation, with very sort of complex issues, yeah. And we understand now what the value of open societies are. And when we talk now about Tibet, about this coexistence, you see, of human and non-human, and about the importance of nature, about the importance of traditional wisdom, I think the Dalai Lama in 1987, and you also mentioned this, has come up with a plan, you see, for the future of this region, which is the 5-point peace plan. And I think in the 5-point peace plan, if you read this again, you will see that many of these aspects, this cultural knowledge is there, this approach of Tibetans to nature, to environment, to a peaceful coexistence with neighbors and so forth is there. And I think this vision is much more powerful than what the Communist Party has to offer to the world. So, and I think if the neighboring countries in Asia would realize this, if we would talk more about this, I think for the future, Tibetans have to offer an incredible strong conceptual framework to tackle these many issues that are in front of us. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Wangpo. Thank you also for reminding how many times we follow this narrative because we see waters, and for example, as a resource. Of course, if we perceive that as something to exploit, clearly conflict will arise because we want to get that resource for us. Inevitably, this will bring conflict. If we see water as a source of life, what I was mentioning before, you are not going to have conflict. Actually, that source of life can be a reason for creating peace building. So it's a completely different way. And the environment, the minerals, the water, all sources of life can bring peace if they are not perceived as something we have to exploit and we need to look after for us, for our greed. So it has a lot of implications which are extremely practical. Are there any other questions from the audience? There's one there. Thank you.
Buon pomeriggio a tutti.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to thank the organizers. So honored to be here with Jetson Bimala and so many important guests. I wanted to express my thoughts. This is very important. This meeting is very important for me. But you know, these 2 days are not enough. We all have to, on an international level, get out on the streets. In Rome, for example, we have Tibetan Plateau. We have so many people who have gone to the Colosseum to talk, to speak out. So all these organizations, we need to demonstrate and to do more meetings because 2 days are not enough. Of course, this is a very important meeting, but we've got to do it out there in the streets. So many people are so important here. So I would like to ask you this because in Tibet, the situation now is very, very critical. But no one listens. No one listens. And even if in Tibet there's so many people who are self-immolating, why the press doesn't talk about it. So this is so important. The climate topic is important, but it's also important for all the association to unite together. And I ask you, please work for us. Thank you.
Grazie Decen.
Thank you, Decen.
Grazie tantissime
Thank you,
Decen,
Thank you so much for your wonderful energy, for being so tireless. We've seen you in so many streets, in so many squares. You really inspired us with your activism. I would like to say this, following what Decen was saying. As Buddhist Union, as ecology agenda, we never organize an event for the sake of it. We always give a follow-up. We're trying to build something here, one piece at a time. We are building on what has been done last year. We are imagining on what to do next year on the basis of what we've built this year. And so this is one of the reasons why we have left some space, some break sessions for some networking. We want to build alliances. We want to do networks that are connections. And then we need to really think about so many events. And we need to create a community with a common objective. There are people who go out in the streets, there are people who work behind the scenes, there are people who are acting in many ways, but what we can guarantee, and I think this is a lifetime commitment as far as I'm concerned, is this, because by ourselves, on our own, we're not going to go anywhere. So I would like to thank all the conversations that we had, not just now, yesterday evening, yesterday, during the coffee breaks, because our commitment has to be to continue these bonds, to unite together, to get organized, and to really go for that radical hope we were talking about before. Yes, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to offer another thought, which may be complementary to others or even contradictory. But you raised one important point just now. Why is there so little recognition? I think there is certain recognition, but certainly not enough, and what the situation actually calls for. We've been talking about colonial rule, about colonialism quite often here. It came up certain times. So I think it's an important conversation we need to have in the West, and looking at Tibet and also from the West onto other peoples. And I think to address the colonialism in Tibet also entails that we in the West need to decolonize our thinking. That means, what I mean by that is we can no longer regard Tibetans, Uyghurs, others, Mongolians, or maybe other peoples in the world as being the little people who can be pushed around by those big powers. We need to acknowledge the agency, the aspirations and the rights of those peoples, and that includes Tibetans. Tibetans are not just a collateral damage, as it appears sometimes when you listen to world leaders or when we talk to people. So this is something we in the West need to think about. We need to decolonize our thought, to elevate the situation, to elevate attention on Tibet, and hence also action. Thanks.
che c'è un'altra domanda.
Is there another question?
Infatti credo che abbiamo finito.
I was saying we're about to finish. We've finished our time.
L'impegno l'abbiamo preso.
Thank you so much. We've made our commitments clear. It's not going to end here, of course. So thank you for being here on a Sunday morning. This really means you care. So it's a reciprocal commitment.
Grazie anche alle persone.
And thank you to the people from home. And if I may say one more word.
It's a great honor to be in the presence of Geston Pema. So thank you so much. Thank you.